I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views.
Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. Independent media matters, and your support makes it possible. If Parallax Views has challenged your thinking, exposed you to new ideas, or simply kept you company on your commute, now's the time to help sustain it. Listen, share, and if you can, support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. If you want, you can also make a one-time donation by contacting me at parallaxviewspod@protonmail.com. I can give you a link to my PayPal page if you contact me that way. Let's show what listener-supported media can do. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners! On this edition of the program, we'll be hearing from Justin Logan, Director of Defense and Foreign Policy Studies at the Cato Institute, about his article, co-written by a friend of the show, Brandan Buck, entitled "Don't Do It, Mr. President," for the American Conservative. Said article deals with the issue of Venezuela. There's a lot of saber rattling going on right now as it relates to Venezuela. Will there be a military intervention by the U.S., an attempt to overthrow Maduro, a regime change operation? Many fear that that is coming, and some are cheerleading it. Recently, we saw the New York Times' Bret Stephens pen a piece entitled "The Case for Overthrowing Maduro." Justin Logan is here to offer the alternative perspective, why it may not be a good idea to overthrow Maduro, even if you're opposed to his reign in Venezuela. All that and more on this edition of Parallax Views, and a reminder, it is you, the listener, that makes this show possible, along with my one sponsor, the mighty Mike Swanson of WallStreetWindow.com. Other than Mike, though, this show is entirely listener-supported, so please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And of course, head on over to wallstreetwindow.com for the best trading and financial newsletter. I've actually had listeners make return on investment due to Mike's trading tips. And if you sign up to the newsletter, you can get a free ebook written by Mike entitled "The Two-Fold Formula, the single best trading pattern I have ever used." I highly recommend Mike's work. He is a straight shooter in the world of stock trading and financial news. So with that being said, let's get right to it with Justin Logan. Welcome to Parallax Views, a first-time guest on the show, recommended to me by a friend of the program, Brandan Buck. I'm speaking with Justin Logan, Director of Defense and Foreign Policy Studies at the Cato Institute, and we're going to be talking an article he wrote with Brandan called "Don't Do It, Mr. President," for the American Conservative, and this pushes back on the narrative emerging that we need regime change in Venezuela. It was funny, I was just reading that, I believe it was the New York Times article by Bret Stephens the other day saying the case for regime change in Venezuela, for overthrowing Maduro, and we're going to push back on that. How are you doing, Justin Logan?
Just fine. Thanks for having me on the show.
So, I guess where we should begin is, what is the supposed case for a regime change in Venezuela, a military intervention, and what's wrong with the narrative we see emerging?
Yeah, I mean, the administration has been cagey, to put it diplomatically, about both the end state its policy seeks and the means with which it will seek that end state. So the president has been quite clear since his first administration. He made a lot of efforts to dislodge Maduro from power that did not work back in 2018. And came into office not liking the man very much. That's, I think, a reasonable view. But in the past 6 or 8 weeks, there has been a ramping up of both diplomatic pressure and now a military strike package in place that looks a lot like the strike package that we used in the Libya intervention back in 2011. So that has raised fears about what it is the administration, both the end state that it seeks, again, and the means with which the means it's going to use to pursue that end state.
Can we talk about the argument that's being made about fentanyl? Venezuela is bringing over drug boats, but it seems like this is a very flawed argument.
Yeah, I mean, it's so flawed that it's almost hard to take on its own terms. So the administration started off with this idea, as you point out, that Venezuela is to blame for a big chunk of the fentanyl crisis in the United States, and that these strikes on alleged drug boats were a way of interdicting the supply of fentanyl to the United States. I mean, there are some just facial empirical problems with this. First is that the White House's own ONDCP report from previously showed that Venezuela is plays a trivial role in the fentanyl supply chain, particularly to the United States. And further, the boats in question didn't have the range to reach the United States. Further than that, the administration has said we're certain that the people on these boats are narco traffickers, but we don't know their names, which has some internal logical flaws there. And on and on and on. The president at one point said that with each one of these strikes, we saved 25,000 American lives. There are about 80,000 total drug overdoses in the United States per year, and I've lost count. At my last count, we were at 19 drug boats, or alleged drug boats that we've hit. So the maths are not mathing, as the kids say. If we're saving 25,000 lives with each strike, and we have 80,000 overdose deaths per year, none of this works. And that is what I think has led people reasonably, I think, to ask what is really going on here, because the public case for the policy has been just not plausible.
You also, in this article, get into how the administration's invocation of the Alien Enemies Act hasn't worked and why that may lead us into a very bad situation, namely the possibility of the United States declaring war. Can you delve into that for my listeners?
Yeah, so the administration has invoked the so-called Alien Enemies Act, I believe 18th century legal instrument, in order to sort of lubricate its policy of deporting, in particular, Venezuelan immigrants to the United States, people who cross the border illegally. And the courts, in a number of cases, have said you can't do this, first and foremost, because the United States isn't at wars, right? So these people are not alien enemies. And again, since the public case is so remarkably empirically challenged, I would say, it's led reasonable observers to say, hey, wait a minute. If the administration is really wound up on deporting Venezuelan migrants and trying to use the Alien Enemies Act to do so, and if the courts have said you can't use that legal justification because we're not at war, it's not a huge leap of logic to wonder whether they've said, well, what if we were at war? And if there were a state of armed conflict between the United States and Venezuela in some way, would the courts be willing to stick to its principle in saying that you can't use the Alien Enemies Act? Would it find another logic or lean harder on another logic? And so again, I'm not one to say what's the real motivation here. I try to take arguments on their own terms. But the public arguments are just gallingly unpersuasive that you do sort of cast about for something that might be a better explanation.
In the article you wrote with Brandan Buck, you talk a little bit about how there's a risk with regards to a Venezuela regime change operation that it could turn into another endless war or a quagmire similar to what we've seen with U.S. involvement in the Middle East. I know there's going to be people that say, well, Latin America, Middle East, they're different How could you say that? I think the comparison you make is this could become something like what we saw in Libya. Why do you make that case? Maybe we could delve into that.
Yeah, so it's certainly true, and let me state at the outset, Latin America is not the Middle East. I'm aware of this. I've heard it a couple of times in my life. But two people do say this, right? It's a fundamentally different environment. But weirdly, if you listen to the Venezuelan opposition, they are perhaps the most persuasive case about how screwed up the institutions in Venezuela are. They're correct to say that there is organized crime, that Colombian cartels are in parts of Venezuela. I mean, on and on and on. If you listen to Maria Corina Machado, the head of the Venezuelan opposition, she's very persuasive on this point, persuasive to me. But if the institutions of the Venezuelan state are as sclerotic and dysfunctional as they're characterized to be, which I basically believe, the idea that you're going to quickly do a Texas switch and sort of take out Maduro and his top 100 or 200 cronies and swap in Machado and 100 or 200 of her people, and this thing is going to sort of wind up effectively just beggars belief, right? And the institutions of the Libyan state, to bring back that example, were completely captivated to a corrupt regime that crumbled. And still to this day, right, there's a lack of central authority in Libya. This is almost 15 years later, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So no comparison is perfect. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, it's chaos, civil war, and open air slave markets in Libya. It's a disaster.
Yes, and yeah, that's pretty bad. And so it doesn't even need to be an exact parallel to Libya, rather. If the institutions of the government are as screwed up as the opposition says they are, then this is going to be a really big project. And that's not to say that, American policy should oppose regime change in Venezuela. It's their country, after all. But making it a project of the American military is going to be a much heavier lift than this idea of sort of, whacking a nasty leader and things being hunky-dory there. And so I think this, to bring it back to the old Colin Powell Pottery Barn principle, if you break it, you buy it, I think the administration might be tempted by the idea that they could break it and not buy it. But I think the political realities, particularly in the United States, but also in Venezuela, are going to really limit their ability to get away with that.
I wanted to ask you a question that's a bit outside of the scope of the article, but it relates to Venezuela. I've seen some people who are supportive of this idea of a Trump-led regime change operation in Venezuela, trying to argue that this is in fact the sort of realist foreign policy position, because America needs to dominate its sphere of influence. How would you respond to those people? Because I think they have some misunderstandings.
Yeah, look, there's the first sort of move there, we should care about the Western Hemisphere, is a reasonable one, right? If you go back to the Monroe Doctrine, of course, this was about keeping European empires out of the Western Hemisphere, right? The British had burned the White House to the ground in the War of 1812, and at the time, there were still very reasonable worries about the French Empire, to a lesser extent the Spanish Empire, but particularly the British Empire in the Western Hemisphere. And so the Monroe Doctrine was this idea, we need to get these empires out and not have any foreign empires in our hemisphere. The move that I think your interlocutors are making, which I disagree with, is the move from the Monroe Doctrine to the Roosevelt corollary, right? So in the early 20th century, President Teddy Roosevelt moved from the Monroe Doctrine of keeping European empires out of the Western Hemisphere to his corollary, which held that the United States was going to, in large part, fix dysfunctional states in the Western Hemisphere ourselves. As a later president would say, we're going to teach them to elect good men. And this was a fundamentally different project. It was an affirmative, capital P, progressive project to remake the institutions of these states ourselves. And it ended in tears, as most such projects do, and later was replaced by the so-called good neighbor policy, where we said we want to have functional relationships with countries in the hemisphere, even if we don't really agree with them or if we think they're kind of screwed up. So there is this reference to the Monroe Doctrine in the terms of, hey, wait a minute, this thing is about the Western Hemisphere, not halfway around the world. But then a leap that says we need to go knock off regimes that we don't like and think are dysfunctional and replace them with better ones. And I think the first move is okay. The second move is where I sort of get off the train.
If you could you talk about some of the obstacles that would exist for a regime change operation? I'm thinking specifically of the fact that, we did regime change in Iraq, but Venezuela is twice the size of Iraq. And also, there's this issue with Maduro. Even if many people in Venezuela aren't necessarily supportive of him, the populace, or they're skeptical of him or have grievances, he still seems to have the loyalty of the military.
Yeah, I mean, wars have a momentum all their own. It's very difficult to predict. I think if you use, in this case, the Libya model as an analog, it's certainly the case. The amount of ordnance that the United States has in the Southcom area of responsibility is about comparable to the strike package that we had in Libya, if you included our allies at the time, who of course ran out of munitions that we had to supplement. But I think the United States is in a position to rain down a lot of fire and brimstone on Caracas. So it is possible, I think, that you could do standoff air power and just blast away at the Venezuelan government and sort of hope for a miracle. And a miracle might happen. But as we learned, you mentioned Iraq, right? The trouble sometimes comes after the regime has been changed, right? You go from an undesirable but stable equilibrium to a disequilibrium. And that restoring some new equilibrium is where the trouble really comes in. So I think it is a defensible argument that the United States has enough firepower in place that it could dislodge the Maduro government. The question is, what would come next and who would be responsible for producing and overseeing that new equilibrium? And that's where I get exceptionally uncomfortable.
I think that brings to mind the point that I wanted to make. So this article you wrote with Brandan is in the American Conservative. So this isn't coming from like a left-wing anti-imperialist point of view, what you're writing. And I think one of the things that conservatives should really think about when talking about Venezuela is, I think that a conservative-minded individual believes in proceeding with caution. You don't want to make mistakes. You don't want to create consequences for your own national security through unexpected events. You want to think everything through. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about why you think conservatives or even libertarian voices should really be paying attention to all this discussion about a possible regime change in Venezuela.
Yeah, I mean, at a basic level, the military is a blunt instrument, right? It's not an effective tool for re-engineering social equilibria in foreign countries. It's really good at destroying things and killing people. And that, in my sort of old-fashioned mindset, is as it should be. But we need to grapple with the idea that all sorts of nasty regimes all over the world don't pose a threat to the United States that warrants the expenditure of billions of dollars and potentially American lives. And that again can set in motion this chain reaction where the United States finds itself holding the bag for all sorts of commitments, particularly at a time where the national debt is $38 trillion. We're adding to it at the rate of $2 trillion per year. And we allegedly face, a potential peer competitor in the form of the People's Republic of China. So there's this sort of spendthrift mentality that says, you only live once and let's get this guy out of here, and not really thinking through what the knock-on consequences will be. So that, I think, unintended consequences, the irrelevance of the purity of one's motivations, and an appreciation of sort of foreign nationalisms, right? If the American nationalists should recognize one thing, it's that foreigners are not American nationalists by and large, and we shouldn't ask them to be. So I think that those just sort of basic rudiments of prudence should weigh heavily here. And I will say, right, the administration has made some arguments that I find unpersuasive and said some things I think are untrue. but they have proceeded in a way that is somewhat measured, right? The president was asked, why do you have this carrier strike group in the Caribbean? And he sort of shrugs and says, well, it's got to be somewhere. And I do think that there is a possibility, potentially a strong possibility, that what the administration is trying to do is to heighten the contradictions in Venezuela, to put pressure and potentially break open fissures in the regime itself, to get a top level advisor to clip Maduro on his own, to convince Maduro that he has a better future outside of Venezuela than inside of it, and then to sort of, move the Ford back to the UCOM area of responsibility without, changing the regime ourselves, which I think would be a much less dangerous and costly prospect for the United States than blasting away at Caracas ourselves.
I was trying to search for the right words, and you found it with unintended consequences. I think that's something everyone, conservative or not, should be concerned about. I mean, the big issue with this idea of a U.S.-led regime change operation with regards to Venezuela is I don't think Venezuela is a national security threat to the United States.
I mean, I just think it's case closed on the question. You're not going to get much of an argument out of me because I just think it's just facially, and we've had all of this pulling and hauling about. It is the case that Russia has a strong relationship with the Maduro regime. I don't like that. I think most Americans don't like it, but its impact for the way we live at home is, in fact, quite limited. And if you think about, I raised the question of the Monroe Doctrine earlier, right? If it's about keeping foreign empires out of the Western Hemisphere, what we're doing right now is incentivizing Venezuela to reach for foreign empires to help it out in the Western Hemisphere, right? It has recently taken, allegedly, a delivery of air defense systems from Russia to potentially try to defend itself against the United States. So we're, in a perverse way, incentivizing the greater presence of foreign empires in the Western Hemisphere by this sort of saber rattling that we're undoing. So, that is, I think, a real concern in the sense that Venezuela itself is not, I think, a threat to the way we live at home. But if we incentivize a greater Russian or Chinese presence in the Western Hemisphere or make other countries in the region reach out to those states, on net, that's not great for us, and we should try to not incentivize that behavior.
I also wanted to ask you about the Trump administration, and you only deal with this briefly in the article, so maybe you could expound on it. But the Trump administration has openly talked about wanting to authorize the CIA to take covert action inside Venezuela. And you point out that, there's already enough paranoia in Venezuela, even dating back to Chavez, Maduro's predecessor, when it comes to American intelligence agencies. So what do you make of that, and can you speak a bit more to that?
Yeah, I mean, it was a weird thing where the New York Times has this big splashy above the fold story about how Trump has issued a presidential finding authorizing CIA covert action inside Venezuela. And the next day he was asked in a press gaggle, hey, what about this story in the New York Times? And he says, yeah, I authorize covert action in Venezuela. And, the action ceases to be covert when you say at a press conference, yeah, we're doing that. It's just the nature of covert action is that it's covert. And so, I think it was a weird turn of events, a weird 24 hours to see the report in the Times and the president affirming that he's authorized CIA covert action in Venezuela. And I also think that, there's a certain paranoia. I mean, look, the U.S. history in Latin America is a checkered one. We tried to blow up Fidel Castro with an exploding cigar. I mean, just crazy, campy movie stuff that we've done.
How many times was it we tried to kill Castro?
Close to a dozen. I think it was into the 8, 9 range. Look, and there were sometimes that the ideas got really hairy, right? The Bay of Pigs was not a great chapter in American history, but I just think that walking into the sort of caricature of surreptitious CIA agents, if a fertilizer factory blew up somewhere in Venezuela, right, it was going to be blamed on the CIA, whether we had a hand in it or not. And I just think that was like a weird thing to do, to sort of walk into the left-wing caricature of, the CIA being behind every natural disaster in Latin America.
Could you speak a bit more to the way in which a sort of forceful regime change doesn't have many direct precedents in the region. I know you talk about Panama in this regard.
Yeah, I mean, the Panama example is probably the other side's best argument, right? Which is to say, this guy got to be a real pain in the neck, and we whacked him, and everything was okay. There are a lot of reasons to push back on that comparison. Size is the first one, right? Panama is a tiny country on an isthmus where the so-called Southcom had, I think, close to 10,000 U.S. soldiers on the ground at present. We had done the spade work where we had the U.S. Embassy in Panama had basically liaised with the opposition, which was closely linked to the government itself. And there was an effective nudging out of Manuel Noriega. The combat itself was over, I think, in less than 2 weeks, like over in the complete sense. But, you know, there again, I think there was the evidence of the spade work that had been done in Panama, where there was not, the institutions themselves stayed very similar to the way they were. Noriega was taken into U.S. custody, and it was a sort of seamless thing. There's very little evidence that that spade work has been done or can be done in Venezuela. Again, the institutions of the state, oppressive and dysfunctional as they are, appear at present to be in the command of Maduro himself. And so if you remove the leadership, if you remove Maduro and his top 100 guys, there's still a very open question about how these sclerotic institutions function or don't function, and who is on the hook for them. So I think the analog of the state of Panama in the 1980s and the state of Venezuela in the 2020s, and the scale of the two, the presence on the ground. Again, we had 10,000 U.S. soldiers on the ground. There were tons of U.S. people at the embassy who had Panamanian spouses. There was like a real intermingling of the U.S. presence and the Panamanian opposition, where they did nudge out Noriega and take over the existing institutions. The existing institutions in Venezuela are so screwed up that nobody wants those institutions to stick around to speak of, other than potentially at this point the military.
And I think with regards to Grenada, the point that you've made is, well, this is a tiny island, you know, so this is different than Venezuela is a different kettle of fish, so to speak.
I would say yes, insanely different. So much so that I think the other side of the argument doesn't even really, they're really hanging a lot on Panama. But even on Panama, questions of scale and questions of the nature of the state, I think belie the comparison.
What would you say that Trump should be, or the Trump administration, I should say, if they're looking for predecessors to inform how they deal with Venezuela, who should they be looking at when it comes to previous American presidents, administrations, and their foreign policy?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, the Trump style, the Trump administration is so idiosyncratic that it's tough to relate it to any other administration. But the sorts of questions that I think they should be asking is there an off-ramp here, right? If what they do want is to raise pressure on Maduro to the point that he either sort of abdicates or is nudged off by one of his lieutenants. The question is, how do you put the gun back in the holster, right? We have, raised anxiety in Caracas and in the upper echelons of the government. If that doesn't work, what is the U.S. plan, right? Because there's going to be a tremendous amount of hay made by those sort of hawkish South Florida types trying to constrain the president's ability to get the gun back into the holster if it comes to that, to say, look, our credibility is on the line. We've said, we don't want Maduro to be around. And again, the president has been pretty cagey on this, to his credit, that he hasn't said regime change is the policy of the United States, right? He's sort of clouded the water with a whole bunch of sometimes contradictory statements, but he's left himself room to maneuver. But I think he wants to ask how the people who are full-bore regime change advocates, how he's going to navigate his way past them if Maduro in fact doesn't go, and to sort of move on to the next news cycle, which the administration, again, you have to admit, is quite good at moving on to the next news cycle.
Um, in regards to history, though, I mean, are there any previous administrations that you think dealt with Latin America better than others? Or maybe a better question is, what are the worst examples of how the U.S. has dealt with Latin America?
Right. I mean, I think that the transition, we touched on this earlier, but maybe it's worth spinning out a bit. The transition from Teddy Roosevelt to FDR, of all people, is notable, right? The Roosevelt corollary led the United States to these really nasty interventions in places like Nicaragua and Haiti. And the United States, sort of after 20 or so years, this is starting to sound familiar maybe, tired of this and said, what are we doing down there? And FDR, to his credit, instituted something called the good neighbor policy that said we're going to have relationships with countries that we don't get along with. We're going to stick to the Monroe Doctrine, right? We don't want foreign empires in the Western Hemisphere, but we're going to tolerate some extent of disorder, some extent of nasty politics that we don't like, and do business with Latin America and get along with Latin America. And I think that was a good, salutary transition. And so I think that issue of, trying to find a way to do business with countries, and, the administration has had a big outburst with respect to Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, where he's, instituted tariffs against Brazil because he's argued that Bolsonaro was mistreated in terms of his prosecution by the subsequent government there of Lula. So I do think that, like, sort of backing off a bit and just saying on the narrow suite of policies that we care deeply about that impact potentially how we live at home, we're not going to move on. But as to sort of your internal politics and what's going on down there, we're going to take a more hands-off approach that again draws an analog from the good neighbor policy of FDR.
Do you think that can be applied even outside of the U.S. relationship with Venezuela? So, for instance, could we learn something from those FDR policies when it comes to how we deal with, say, Cuba or, like you said, Brazil?
Yeah, I mean, I bow to nobody in my distaste for Cuban communism, but we have to square up to the fact that it's bad for Cubans primarily, right? It's not a U.S. security threat, right? The Cuban Missile Crisis notwithstanding, that was an awful long time ago. So I do think that we need to, and it's not to say there are all sorts of levers that the United States government can use to incentivize and disincentivize freedom or dictatorship, as the case may be. But I think that once we make this about U.S. national security, it scrambles everybody's brains. And understandably, we say, well, hey, wait a minute. If this is about our security, we're willing to pay huge costs and run huge risks about these policies, when in fact I think the State Department should be the main arm of American diplomacy. I'm a sort of old-fashioned institutionalist in that sense, and so there are all sorts of things that American diplomats can do, again, to incentivize freedom and disincentivize dictatorship that don't involve carrier strike groups and saber rattling across the region.
One thing, so I mentioned the article was written in the American Conservative, but I think, like a number of articles I've read in the American Conservative, I don't think this is an issue where you have to be right wing or left wing or just a liberal or a social democrat or a conservative. I think this matters regardless of where you fit in the political spectrum. And I think there's common ground that people can find for why this regime change talk is dangerous, especially if it's implemented. Do you want to speak to that? How I think there may be a way in which this can be talked about without even political tribalism coming into play.
Yeah, no, sure. And I think there's, muscle memory in the sort of left-right ecosystem in Washington, right? I'm old enough to remember the dark days of 2003, 2004, 2005, where there were some, I'll refer to my left-wing friends with, measured derision as sort of commies, right? I love them though because we were able to work together on things like the Iraq War, things like heading off an Iran war, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a tremendous amount. This is not an exclusively conservative argument or libertarian argument or progressive argument or socialist argument, right? There are foreign policies that are costly and bad. And again, particularly in an era where we're $38 trillion in debt and adding to that debt at a rate of $2 trillion a year with really no hope on the horizon of constraining that spending, we're in a realm of scarcity. And so the idea that we should light up Venezuela and potentially take knock-on costs into the billions, tens of billions, or even further dollars to clean up the mess we've made isn't an exclusively conservative or progressive one. It should include lots of people.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, to me, it's a taxpayer issue. You know, if you're a conservative, maybe you're thinking, well, why do I want my taxpayer dollars to go to overthrowing another regime? If you're a social democrat, you may think, well, I want it to go to domestic programs to help with like welfare and whatnot. So I think there's arguments on both sides for why regime change may be foolhardy, and I just think it's a strain on the taxpayer.
No, of course. I mean, the bumper sticker is we shouldn't do dumb, costly things because they're dumb and we don't have a lot of money to throw around. Right. There's your, I mean, and you know, that again, if you save money by not doing dumb things, you know, lefties and right wingers would have all sorts of different ideas about what, if anything, that money that wasn't spent should be spent on. But not doing the dumb, costly thing, I think you can find consensus on both left and right.
I also wanted to ask you, I don't know if you had a chance to read it before the show, but I mentioned that we have this Bret Stephens article, The Case for Overthrowing Maduro. Stephens, of course, comes from that sort of neoconservative mold that gave us the Iraq War. Do you have any thoughts on the fact that figures like Stephens, who are notably anti-Trump, are actually kind of like, maybe this would be good if Trump did this?
Yeah, I'm going to make maybe a bad think tanker confession. I've decided not to read Bret Stephens. I find him to be both entirely predictable and irrelevant to contemporary politics. The guy is like a broken record. I mean, I wrote a nasty review of a book that he wrote 10 or 12 years ago. And I just find both the analysis there and the predictability of it to be unnecessary, right? So
I don't blame you.
There is something weird going on where there is the sort of conservatives that break through, or people call themselves conservatives, the people who fit the conservative box at legacy sort of mainstream media, liberal outlets like the New York Times, tend to be exceptionally violent in their foreign policy views. And I think that's really out of step with where the conservative movement is heading now. If you look at people like Tom Massey, if you look at people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, if you look at people like J.D. Vance, they have basically nothing in common with a person like Bret Stephens. So it's a perverse outcome that so many of the people in legacy media outlets who are portrayed as being conservative are so out of step with the actual Republican Party. And I don't have a great explanation for why that is, but I've decided in the interest of my own sanity and paying attention to arguments that I need to pay attention to, that I can afford to ignore Bret Stephens.
I that's music to my ears. I also want to ask you, do you think that there's an issue with the way Trump is maybe going back on some of the promises he made to realist and restraint-oriented voters?
Yes, I think there are a couple of different problems. One is that my best reading of the polling data, and you should take this for what it's worth, I know enough to be dangerous, but not more, is that the voters are getting too much foreign policy. They just don't want this much focus on foreign policy. They want to focus on, again, the way they live at home, how much stuff costs, whether they're able to buy homes, things of this nature. And there's a real churn in the base of the Republican Party that says whatever's going on with Gaza or Ukraine or now Venezuela, we're here, we live here, and we care about how things are here, so help us here. And so that broader sense that there's, and this is bad for foreign policy wonks like me, right? I work on foreign policy. I'm supposed to want foreign policy to be in the news, to be talked about, people like you to want to talk to me. But I think that American voters are kind of exhausted with foreign policy and want less of it. And then on the substance, yeah, I think there's a real disconnect where people are saying America first means America first, or you've heard in the ecosystem lately, America only, right? I'm not an America only guy, but I do think that people who pay taxes to the American state and elect leaders of the American state are mostly, if not entirely, concerned about America. That's like not a crazy thing for people to feel like. And so I do think they both want less foreign policy in terms of like what American politics is focused on. And maybe a way to put it is, and they want a smaller foreign policy in the extent that they don't want lots of revolutionary programs in Gaza or Latin America.
Can I provide like one little bit of pushback on that, and it's not really pushback. I think it's more so that Americans, it's not that they have an issue with foreign policy, it's that they have an issue with reckless foreign policy, and especially military interventions or funding of a conflict that we're not involved in.
Yeah, I mean, I would put it right. So it
I
may
don't
be a
think we're
different view.
anti-diplomacy, for example.
Sure. No, for sure. But the costs are the crucial variable there that you've put your finger on, right? Is that, running big costs is unpopular. But I also think that there is a frustration with the attention of the American government, the Trump administration, being so disproportionately on foreign policy issues rather than domestic policy issues. Again, I think there's a real frustration with the price levels versus earnings in terms of households, right? How expensive things are, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm open to the idea that there's very little that the American government can do to remedy those problems. But I think out there in the country at large, it's not just costly foreign policies that are opposed, but the extent to which the Trump administration's attention has been so heavily on foreign policy issues versus domestic policy issues.
Before we close out, I remember when I was younger, even going back to like middle school, I would argue with people about the Iraq War. I was very against the intervention in Iraq, and one of the lines I would always hear is, "But those poor Iraqis, they're living under this dictatorship of Saddam Hussein." And we also hear that line with regards to Maduro. But what about the Venezuelans that live under the dictatorship? And I feel that it's a very emotionally manipulative sort of use of rhetoric because I'm not against Venezuelans or Iraqis. I just am not sure that we necessarily can be like the world police that saves everyone. And I think often we can create new problems. Do you want to speak to that? The sort of it just feels like emotional blackmail at times.
Yeah, I certainly do. It's Venezuela's country, after all, right? So I certainly don't fault them for having passionate views about their own the terrible dictatorship that holds the reins of power in their own country. But it's when that is sort of transposed onto the U.S. military's problem to solve, there's a total disconnect there, right? If Venezuelans are able to overthrow Maduro, I wish them all the best, right? And I'd be willing for, again, the State Department or, I think American oil companies are champing at the bit to get back in there. They have the largest known reserves of oil in the world. And so, I think there's all sorts of things that American institutions can, would, and should do in the wake of Maduro's ouster. But it's this sort of stealthy sneaking in of, don't you understand how terrible things are for Venezuelans, to the U.S. military needs to knock off the regime, where I say, hey, wait a minute, I was with you there. I don't like Maduro. I think he's a terrible dictator. But that middle step where you said, and therefore we need a U.S.-led regime change, is where I got off the bandwagon. And, the one phrase that you hear in U.S. foreign policy a lot that really makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up is, it can't get worse. Because we saw in the Iraq case, it kind of did get worse, right? There were hundreds of thousands, conservatively, of people killed in the ensuing insurgency after the regime was changed in 2003. And it was just a maelstrom, a charnel house of violence and madness and mayhem. And so whenever when someone says it can't get worse, yeah, that sort of makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up because so often in history it has gotten worse.
In closing, since I know you're the director of Defense and Foreign Policy Studies at the Cato Institute, I was wondering if you could talk about the sort of foreign policy vision that you and others at the Cato Institute have, because I think it's often unfairly overlooked in a lot of foreign policy debates. You provide a very necessary and refreshing alternative to maybe the status quo that we've had for far too long.
Sure. I mean, if it's unfairly overlooked, that is my fault. So I can't, the buck stops with me. No, I think that the legacy of the Cato, the view of Cato scholars on foreign and defense issues is that it has a long but sort of forgotten legacy in U.S. politics. And if you look at Washington's farewell address, I think I would take that straight into my veins today. If you look at Cold War statesmen like George Kennan, who coined the term containment and then almost immediately said, this is being misapplied, I was never for this. But the idea essentially is that the United States is a uniquely secure country by dint of our geography. The founders of our country realized that and wanted to run an experiment that a small R republic could be fundamentally different than the European states that they looked at with disgust at the time. They didn't like the centralization of power in an executive. They certainly didn't like kings and queens. And they wanted to run an experiment where we could have, again, a small R republic that was fiercely jealous of its own neighborhood, but didn't have grand designs to run an empire. And I think, there are signs both on left and right that we're coming back to an appreciation of limits on foreign policy, limits on executive power, an appreciation of civil liberties and decentralization. The libertarian point is big foreign policies are really expensive too. And so they consolidate power in the executive branch, they do violence to civil liberties, and on and on and on. You had the FBI infiltrating left-wing groups during the Cold War, bombing cars to make, to pit one faction against another, right? It's a really nasty business having big foreign policies.
Isn't there also, and I think this gets into the libertarian argument, I think there's a way in which soft power or cultural power or just trading with other people can actually be more effective than, bombing countries.
No, that's certainly true that we reduce things to the military at our peril, but I think that the fundamental belief that, if I were looking to hire somebody, I would want them to believe, is that we're really secure and we should be jealous about using military power for things that are not about our security. I'm not ipso facto against humanitarian intervention, but they often get made into this is actually about our security, where again, that sort of scrambles people's brains and say, oh, well, if it's about our security, let's go wheels up today and start dropping bombs tomorrow. And I think that too often these assumptions are spirited into the argument where it's not at all about our security, which doesn't necessarily mean we shouldn't care about it, but it does mean that we should be measured and ask hard questions about how we think things are likely to go.
I was just going to say in regards to that, you're reminding me of the John Quincy Adams speech where he says, America should not go in search of monsters to destroy. With regards to that point you brought up about America's geography, I've actually brought that up too. I feel like America has Canada to the north and Latin America to the south, and we're separated from a lot of other countries by two oceans. So I think it's only natural for Americans to feel like, well, why do we have to intervene? Do you think that's becoming a bigger issue in political discourse in America? Because I feel like the natural inclination of a lot of the populace is, well, we can just be friendly with other countries and there aren't really that many security threats.
I mean, the American foreign policy establishment hates good news. It's a weird thing that I've never been able to understand. But yeah, I mean, the what you just elucidated was a quote that I haven't convinced myself isn't apocryphal. It may be apocryphal, but attributed to Jean-Jules Jusserand, the French ambassador to the United States during the Great War, who said America is blessed among the nations. On the north and south, it has weak, friendly neighbors, and on the east and west, it has fish. And there's a sense in which this sort of hoity-toity foreign policy types will say, oh, well, you don't understand how the internet and intercontinental ballistic missiles exist now, and they didn't exist at that time, and that changes everything. I think it actually makes it more true, right? The United States has a huge nuclear arsenal. It has a big Navy. And that, in fact, compounds the security afforded the United States by geography. It doesn't negate it, right? And so, yeah, I think that view would be dismissed out of hand as Neanderthal isolationism by, the cafeteria at, one or the other think tank up and down Massachusetts Avenue where I work in DC. But I think it has a lot to be said for it. And I think it's gaining more currency, again, among the kind of Thomas Massey, Ro Khanna, Marjorie Taylor Greene constituency that just stopping and saying, hey, wait a minute, why is this about us and why is this our problem?
Well, hey, Justin, I want to thank you again for coming on Parallax Views. Anything else you want to say in closing that I missed? And if you could you let my listeners know how they can keep up with your work?
Sure. No, I think we did. We covered the waterfront there. I'm appreciative for you having me on. You can follow our work at cato.org, or God forbid if you're on Twitter. My Twitter handle is Justin T like Tom Logan, or at Justin T Logan, I guess I'm supposed to say.
Thank you so much for coming on Parallax Views.
My great pleasure. Thank you.
Until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views. To Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.